Judge Harold Thompson adjusted his glasses as he glanced over the docket for the morning session. It was just another routine day, minor offenses, fines, and a few public disturbances. He had long since grown accustomed to the rhythm of his courtroom, where cases often involved familiar faces and predictable outcomes. Today's docket included a traffic violation, a simple speeding ticket, something the judge was sure he'd resolve within minutes. Dr. Nicole Carter stood in the hallway, waiting her turn to enter the courtroom. She wore a tailored navy suit, her posture straight and confident. Despite her professional attire and poised demeanor, the few people who noticed her couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. She didn't fit the typical profile of someone who'd show up for a minor traffic violation, but she seemed unfazed by the stares, as if she were completely at ease in her surroundings. When her name was called, she walked into the courtroom with purpose, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. Judge Thompson didn't recognize her immediately, and it didn't matter to him. He saw the paperwork in front of him. Dr. Carter had been caught speeding late one evening. Her explanation, written on the form, seemed like a routine response. She had been late to a meeting, and the traffic had been unexpectedly heavy. "Dr. Carter, I trust you understand the reason for your appearance today." Judge Thompson's voice was firm, his tone leaving little room for argument. He wasn't in the mood for excuses. Traffic violations were simple. They required no deep thinking or discussion. Dr. Carter nodded calmly. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand." Judge Thompson briefly scanned her explanation, his eyes flicking up to meet hers. He was a man who believed in structure, in adhering to the rules. Dr. Carter's composed expression made him uneasy. There was a certain air of confidence about her, perhaps too much for someone who had just been caught breaking the law. "You're requesting leniency for being late?" Judge Thompson asked, his eyebrows furrowing slightly. His gaze was sharp as he looked over her paperwork again. "I see no reason to reduce the fine. The law is the law, Dr. Carter, and everyone must be held accountable, regardless of their position." Dr. Carter didn't flinch. She spoke with a calm clarity. "I understand, Your Honor. I'll pay the fine as required." There was no protest, no attempt to argue or justify her actions further, just quiet acceptance. That quiet resolve irked Judge Thompson in a way he couldn't quite explain. He'd dealt with many people who challenged his authority in his years on the bench. Most of them had been brash, emotional, or confrontational. But Dr. Carter's composed, almost distant response left him unsettled. It was as if she wasn't fazed by the court at all. The judge scribbled the fine amount onto the sheet, and with a decisive motion, he slapped the gavel down. "The fine is set," he declared, his voice echoing throughout the room. "Court is adjourned." Dr. Carter stood, collected her things, and walked out without a word, leaving the judge with a lingering sense of discomfort that he couldn't shake. There was something about her presence that stuck with him, but he brushed it aside. After all, it was just another case, wasn't it? Yet, in the back of his mind, the question remained, who was she really? As Judge Thompson returned to his chambers, he couldn't help but replay the encounter in his mind. There was something about Dr. Carter that bothered him, something that didn't sit right. It wasn't that she'd done anything overtly wrong. She had been respectful, polite, and straightforward in her interactions. But her demeanor, her calmness in the face of a fine, had felt almost dismissive. Judge Thompson prided himself on running a fair and just courtroom. He was known for being level-headed, meticulous, and impartial in his rulings. Yet Dr. Carter's response, her lack of visible concern, had thrown him off. Most people, after all, would protest, argue, or at least show some sign of frustration when facing a fine. But Dr. Carter had accepted it without a hint of resistance. That level of detachment struck him as odd, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't taking the situation seriously. It was almost as if she had more important things on her mind, and a speeding ticket was a trivial matter in comparison. He had always valued the structure of the law, the clarity of rules. His rulings were always straightforward. No exceptions, no favors. To him, The law was a means to maintain order in a chaotic world, and no one was exempt from it, not even someone as composed as Dr. Carter. She had probably been speeding because she thought she could get away with it, perhaps believing her position or status would excuse her from the consequences. The more Judge Thompson thought about it, the more convinced he became of his assumptions. Dr. Carter, with her polished appearance and businesslike attitude, likely thought she was above reproach, someone who had the connections or the influence to avoid the full consequences of her actions. He knew people like her, people who lived in their own bubble, detached from the reality of ordinary citizens. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. A bailiff stepped inside, handing him a stack of files for the next case. Judge Thompson nodded absent-mindedly, still preoccupied with the image of Dr. Carter. She had left the courtroom without so much as a glance back, and that was another detail that stood out. In his experience, people either wanted to argue or, if they accepted their fate, at least acknowledged it with a look of resignation or frustration. But Dr. Carter had walked away as though the fine had been nothing more than a minor detail in her busy life. Still, he couldn't dwell on it for too long. There were cases to be handled, and the rhythm of the courtroom couldn't be disrupted by fleeting distractions. But as the day wore on, Dr. Carter's face, calm, unreadable, kept appearing in his thoughts. Was she really as unaffected as she seemed, or was there more to her than what met the eye? Judge Thompson dismissed the thought for now. He had a job to do. But a small, nagging curiosity lingered at the back of his mind, one that would grow stronger with each passing day. A few days after Dr. Nicole Carter's appearance in Judge Thompson's courtroom, the small town buzzed with whispers. Her name had come up in conversation more than once, with people speculating about who she really was. Some townsfolk remarked on her composed demeanor, while others couldn't quite understand why someone who appeared so important would be dealing with a routine speeding ticket. It was these murmurs that caught the attention of Tom Harris, a reporter for the local newspaper, the OvercomingTheStorm. Tom was always on the lookout for a compelling story, and the mysterious woman who had walked through the courthouse seemed like the perfect subject. Intrigued by her calm demeanor and her apparent detachment from the consequences of the fine, Tom decided to dig a little deeper. He started by calling the courthouse to gather basic details, but there wasn't much to go on. Dr. Carter's case was just another violation in a list of many, and there was no indication of anything unusual in the official record. Yet something about her stood out. There had to be more to the story, Tom thought, especially given how few people in the town seemed to know anything about her beyond the speeding ticket. The first step was a visit to the local library, where Tom combed through old archives and public records. He found an article from a few years prior about a Dr. Nicole Carter who had been recognized for her work in the legal field, an article buried in the back pages of the paper. He noticed that the title read, International Legal Officer for Military Affairs. His curiosity piqued. Tom dove deeper into the search. What he uncovered was nothing short of astonishing. Dr. Carter wasn't just any lawyer. She was a key figure in international law, working as the legal officer for global military operations. Her work involved ensuring legal compliance for military operations in conflict zones, advising generals and high-ranking officials on the intricacies of international treaties, and even negotiating peace accords in some of the world's most volatile regions. Tom's jaw dropped as he read about her role in helping to shape the legal frameworks for military engagement, all while ensuring the protection of human rights on a global scale. This wasn't the typical background of someone getting a traffic ticket in Oak Ridge, a town known for its quiet streets and unremarkable daily life. Tom was struck by the stark contrast between the woman he had read about and the woman who had walked into Judge Thompson's courtroom. How could someone of Dr. Carter's stature have dealt with such a minor issue so casually? There was a story here, one far beyond a simple speeding violation, and Tom knew he had stumbled upon something much bigger. He quickly reached out to Dr. Carter for an interview, hoping to get a deeper understanding of her career, and perhaps uncover the full scope of her role in the world. As he drafted his email, Tom wondered how Dr. Carter would respond. Would she agree to an interview? Or would she prefer to keep her life and her career out of the public eye? Whatever the answer, one thing was certain. This was no ordinary case, and Dr. Nicole Carter was no ordinary woman. Judge Harold Thompson had never thought much about the lives of the people who passed through his courtroom, at least not beyond their cases. His job was to enforce the law, and he'd always taken a somewhat detached approach. But since Dr. Nicole Carter's appearance, something about her had lingered in his mind, an itch he couldn't scratch. When he'd first seen her in court, she'd seemed so out of place in that small town, so unaffected by the fine, as though it was the least important thing on her agenda. He had assumed she was just another person of importance, probably a local professional who thought they could coast by on their status. But the more he thought about it, the more he questioned whether he had made the right call. It wasn't until a few days later that the true scope of Dr. Carter's life came crashing into Judge Thompson's world. He was sitting in his office reviewing a case when his phone rang. It was a colleague, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Reynolds, who worked in a branch of the military with which Thompson occasionally interacted. Reynolds had been in the courtroom a few years ago for a case involving military protocol, and the two had exchanged a few pleasantries since. "Judge Thompson, I need to ask if you know a Dr. Nicole Carter." Reynolds' voice was laced with curiosity, but there was also something in his tone that made Thompson pause. "I know the name. She was in my courtroom a few days ago. Traffic violation." "Why?" The judge was nonchalant, not expecting the direction the conversation was about to take. "Because, Judge," Reynolds continued, "Dr. Carter is one of the top legal officers for military operations, and she's involved in international law for the Army. She handles military strategy, peace negotiations, and the legality of combat operations. She's part of the reason some global treaties are in place. I'm surprised you didn't know." The words hit Thompson like a cold wave. He sat back in his chair, momentarily stunned. Dr. Nicole Carter, the composed woman he had found, was not just a professional. She was a key player in global military and legal affairs, a legal officer with a position of international importance. The realization felt like a punch to his gut. How had he misjudged her so completely? "I had no idea," the judge muttered under his breath. The conversation quickly ended, but Thompson couldn't stop thinking about it. It was hard to reconcile the woman who had walked so calmly into his courtroom with the person Reynolds had just described. How had someone with such an extraordinary role, such a high profile, ended up in front of him over a speeding ticket? The truth was unsettling. Judge Thompson had assumed too much, judged too quickly. His bias had clouded his judgment, and now the consequences of his assumptions seemed to echo louder with each passing moment. He realized that he needed to learn more about Dr. Carter, to understand the woman he had so easily dismissed as just another case. He couldn't ignore it any longer. There was a deeper story here, and he had to face it. The news hit the local papers like a thunderclap. The Oak Ridge Times published an article that caught everyone by surprise, including Judge Thompson. The headline read, "Local woman, Dr. Nicole Carter, plays a key role in global military legal affairs." Beneath it, the article unveiled a side of Dr. Carter that no one in Oak Ridge could have imagined. As the details poured out, the small town learned that Dr. Carter was not just a local professional with a busy life. She was a highly respected legal officer who worked on international military operations. She had spent years advising government officials and military leaders on complex issues such as peace treaties, military strategy, and human rights laws in conflict zones. Her name appeared in legal journals, her decisions shaped international protocols, and she had even been consulted on some of the most critical moments in global diplomacy. The revelation was jarring. People who had seen her only as a calm and seemingly aloof woman on the day of her court appearance were now faced with the enormity of her accomplishments. They learned that she wasn't just someone passing through. She was a key player in some of the world's most consequential events. For Judge Thompson, the article hit him harder than he had anticipated. As he read through the details, it became painfully clear just how far off he had been in his initial assumptions. He had perceived Dr. Carter's poise in court as something close to indifference, but now, in the light of her true role, he realized that it wasn't detachment. It was composure, a trait honed by years of working in high-stakes environments where calmness was essential. His mind raced. How could he have missed this? How could he have allowed his assumptions to cloud his judgment so easily? The traffic violation, the fine. He had treated it as an ordinary case, just another routine matter to tick off his list. But it had been far from ordinary. And now, the fallout from his actions began to settle in. People in Oak Ridge were talking about Dr. Carter's impressive career, but they were also starting to question the fairness of Judge Thompson's decision. The whispers grew louder. Did he treat her differently because of how she appeared? Did he impose the fine simply because he assumed she was someone who wouldn't care about the consequences? The questions weren't just coming from the townspeople, they were starting to echo in the judge's own thoughts. As he sat at his desk, grappling with the weight of his mistake, he realized that his own bias had led him to overlook the larger picture. He had made an error of judgment, not because of the facts, but because of the way he had seen Dr. Carter. She wasn't the type of person he'd expected to find in his courtroom, and he had let that expectation cloud his perception. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that this was bigger than a simple legal error. This was about seeing people for who they truly were, not based on assumptions, not based on how they looked or how they acted in one brief moment, but understanding the depth of their lives and experiences. And now, Dr. Carter's story was out in the open, leaving Judge Thompson to face the uncomfortable truth. He had been wrong, and he would need to find a way to make it right. The next morning, Judge Thompson sat at his desk, staring at the newspaper article that had rattled him so deeply. His thoughts churned, a mix of regret and realization clouding his mind. He had made a mistake, a big one, not just in his professional capacity, but as a person. The more he thought about Dr. Carter, the more he wondered how many others had made similar assumptions about her. How many times had he, without thinking, allowed superficial judgments to shape his views? As the day wore on, a call came through to his office. The voice on the other end was calm and composed. Dr. Nicole Carter. "Good afternoon, Judge Thompson," she said with an unmistakable grace. "I'd like to meet with you." The judge's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what to expect. He had feared she would be angry, perhaps even confrontational. But there was an undeniable sincerity in her tone that made him hesitate before responding. "Of course, Dr. Carter," he said, his voice steady despite the unease swirling in his chest. "When would be convenient for you?" "I can come by your office in an hour," she replied. "I believe there are some things we should discuss." An hour later, Dr. Carter stood in the doorway of Judge Thompson's chambers. She was the same as she had been in court, composed, poised, and professional. There was no sign of anger in her expression, no indication of frustration over the fine she had been given. In fact, it almost seemed like she wasn't there to discuss the ticket at all. Instead, there was a quiet strength about her that seemed to put the judge at ease, even as his internal discomfort grew. "Thank you for meeting with me," she began, stepping into the room. "I understand you've had some questions since our last encounter." Judge Thompson nodded, gesturing to a chair across from him. "I owe you an apology, Dr. Carter. I wasn't aware of the scope of your career when I made my decision. I acted out of assumption, and it was wrong. I should have taken the time to understand who you were before imposing that fine." Dr. Carter sat down, her posture straight but relaxed. "You don't owe me an apology, Judge," she said. Her voice was measured, but there was a quiet confidence behind every word. "I understand that you have a job to do, and it's not easy to step outside the lines when you're in that position. The law is the law. I respect that." The judge felt a weight lift from his shoulders at her words, but it was immediately replaced by a sense of guilt. "But I didn't see you as a person. I saw you as a case, and I assumed you were just like anyone else who came before me." "I understand," Dr. Carter replied with a small nod. "You see, Judge Thompson, I've spent my career working in environments where people often overlook the context. They see someone in uniform or a professional setting and assume they know everything about them. But we all have our stories. Our lives are more complex than what's on the surface. Your decision, though it wasn't personal, reflected the way people sometimes judge others without understanding the full picture. There was no bitterness in her voice, no trace of resentment. She was speaking with an honesty that cut through the tension. The judge listened intently, his guilt now mingled with a growing respect for the woman before him. "I've made a lot of assumptions in my life," he said slowly. "But I'll learn from this. I'll make sure I never make that mistake again." Dr. Carter smiled faintly. "That's all anyone can do, Judge. Learn, grow, and do better. And sometimes that starts with acknowledging that we don't always know what's best for someone else." The room fell into a quiet stillness, the weight of the conversation settling between them. For the first time in days, Judge Thompson felt like he was finally understanding something deeper than the law itself. It wasn't just about following rules. It was about recognizing the humanity in others, no matter how different their experiences may be. Dr. Carter stood to leave, her expression unchanged but her words lingering in the air. "Thank you for your time, Judge Thompson. I hope this meeting is a step toward a better understanding for both of us." As she left his office, Judge Thompson sat back in his chair, reflecting on the conversation. There was much more to Dr. Nicole Carter than he had ever realized, and much more he needed to learn about the people who came before him. As the door closed softly behind Dr. Carter, Judge Thompson remained seated, his hands resting on the desk before him. Her words echoed in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. The conversation had been unexpected, far more profound than he could have imagined when he agreed to meet with her. Dr. Carter hadn't come to challenge him, hadn't come to confront him about the fine. Instead, she had come to offer understanding, to explain in her own quiet way why his judgment had been misplaced. And in doing so, she had opened his eyes. He had always prided himself on being fair and impartial, believing that his decisions were based solely on the facts presented to him. But Dr. Carter's calm acceptance had illuminated something he hadn't wanted to admit. He had been quick to judge. He hadn't considered the possibility that just because someone appeared unaffected by the situation, it didn't mean they didn't take it seriously. Her life, her role in the world, had been beyond the scope of what he could have imagined. She wasn't just a person passing through Oak Ridge. She was someone whose decisions impacted lives on a global scale, whose work affected the course of nations. But that day in court, he hadn't seen her as any of that. He had seen her only as a defendant in a traffic violation case, and in doing so, he had failed to consider the complexities of her life. The realization stung. How many other times had he made similar assumptions? How many times had he looked at someone's outward appearance, their demeanor, and assumed that he knew everything about them? His job was to administer justice, not just with the law, but with empathy and understanding. And yet, in that moment, he had allowed his biases, his ingrained perceptions about what a typical defendant might look like, to cloud his decision-making. As he sat there in his office, alone with his thoughts, Judge Thompson began to rethink his approach to his role. It wasn't enough to simply follow the rules. The law was a tool, a framework, but it had to be applied with compassion and awareness. There was a human story behind every case, a unique perspective that needed to be understood, not just judged. It wasn't just Dr. Carter's career that had been brought to light. It was his own blind spots. He had never questioned the assumptions he made about the people who walked into his courtroom, never stopped to consider the depth of their lives beyond the surface. He realized now that he had been living in a world of black and white, when the truth was far more nuanced. Dr. Carter's presence in his courtroom, though it had initially seemed like a simple case, had forced him to confront his own flaws. And though he would always respect the law, he knew he had to approach it with a new perspective, a perspective that acknowledged the complexities of the people he served. The thought was both humbling and liberating. There would be no turning back. Judge Thompson knew that he would carry this lesson with him for the rest of his career, and more importantly, for the rest of his life. The judge stood up from his desk and walked to the window, gazing out over the quiet town. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was certain. He would never judge someone the same way again. And that, he realized, was the beginning of real justice. Weeks passed since Judge Thompson's meeting with Dr. Nicole Carter, but the lessons from that conversation continued to resonate within him. He found himself more reflective, more deliberate in his decisions, and less quick to assume things about people based on their appearances or circumstances. The shift was subtle at first, but it began to show in the way he handled cases, and eventually, in the way he approached life outside the courtroom. One afternoon, as he sat in his chambers reviewing a complex civil case, the courthouse receptionist came in to inform him of a visitor. To his surprise, it was Dr. Carter herself. Judge Thompson. She greeted him with the same composed demeanor, though there was a warmth to her smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," he replied, standing up to offer her a seat. "It's good to see you again, Dr. Carter." She declined the chair for the moment, standing by his desk with a certain energy about her. "I just wanted to stop by to thank you for the conversation we had a while ago. It meant more to me than you might realize." Judge Thompson was taken aback, unsure of what to say. "I should be the one thanking you," he said sincerely. "You made me realize how much I had to learn, not just about the law, but about people. You've truly changed my perspective on many things." Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad. That was the point of our discussion, after all. But it's not just about changing perspectives. It's about continuous growth. We all have room to learn and improve." Thompson leaned back, the weight of her words settling in. "You know, I've thought a lot about what you said, and I've been working hard to make sure I'm doing more than just enforcing the law. I'm trying to see the full picture, to treat every person with the understanding that they are more than just a case, more than just a single moment in time." Dr. Carter's expression softened. "I can see that. It's evident in the way you've been handling things lately. I've heard good things from people who've come before you recently. They say there's been a shift, that you're listening more carefully. That's what matters." The judge felt a swell of pride, though tempered by humility. "I still have a long way to go, but I want to keep improving. I owe it to everyone who walks into this courtroom." There was a brief pause before Dr. Carter spoke again, her tone now more personal. "I've been meaning to tell you something, Judge Thompson. After that day in your courtroom, I realized something important about myself too. I often forget how much power I have to influence others, how much the way I present myself affects how people perceive me. I was so focused on doing my job at the highest level, on serving on the international stage, that I didn't realize how my own composure could lead others to form judgments about me. That day in your courtroom, you taught me the value of taking the time to show more of myself, of being open, of connecting with people more deeply." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "It's all about balance, isn't it? Understanding when to stand firm, but also when to open up and truly engage." Dr. Carter smiled. "Exactly." Their conversation ended with a shared sense of respect, an acknowledgement that both had learned from one another in ways they hadn't expected. As Dr. Carter left his chambers, Judge Thompson felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had come to realize that true justice wasn't just about upholding the law. It was about understanding, compassion, and recognizing the humanity in every person who came before him. In the weeks that followed, the town of Oak Ridge began to see a subtle but unmistakable change in the way its court operated. Judge Thompson's reputation shifted from one of strict adherence to the law to one of fairness, empathy, and wisdom. He had learned that justice was never black and white. It was a tapestry woven from the diverse experiences of those who sought it, and he was determined to treat each case with the depth and consideration it deserved. As for Dr. Nicole Carter, she returned to her work with a new sense of awareness as well, understanding that while her career was critical, her humanity was just as important. And though her path and the judges were different, they both knew that their brief encounter had set them on a path of greater understanding, both of the law and of the people they served. In the end, they both understood that true change comes not just from learning about the law, but from learning about people. And sometimes, it's the smallest moments that teach the most.